The Western establishment is in absolute meltdown. And for once, it's not about their internal political theater. No, this panic runs deeper than electoral cycles or stock market fluctuations. What we're witnessing is the existential terror of former colonial powers as they watch their centuries-old grip on Africa finally loosening. The establishment of Russian military bases across the continent has sent shockwaves through Washington, Paris, and London, but not for the reasons their propaganda machines would have you believe. This isn't about democracy versus authoritarianism, as they frame it in their sanitized newsrooms. This is about the fundamental restructuring of global power dynamics and Africa's strategic emergence as a sovereign force that refuses to be anyone's perpetual junior partner. The Western elites understand something their public discourse desperately tries to obscure. Africa is no longer asking for permission to chart its own course. Let's examine what's really driving this panic, because understanding their fear reveals the magnitude of Africa's ascending power and the sophisticated strategic thinking that leaders like Ibrahim Traoré represent. To comprehend the depth of Western anxiety, we must first acknowledge the brutal efficiency of their historical control mechanisms. For centuries, European powers maintained dominance through a carefully orchestrated system of economic extraction, political manipulation, and, when necessary, direct military intervention. The architecture of neocolonialism wasn't accidental. It was methodically designed to ensure that African nations remained suppliers of raw materials while importing finished goods at inflated prices. This system generated obscene wealth for Western corporations while keeping African economies in permanent dependency. France's CFA franc zone represents perhaps the most egregious example of this financial colonialism, forcing 14 African nations to deposit their foreign reserves in the French treasury, while requiring French approval for any expenditure exceeding a modest threshold. Meanwhile, British and American corporations established similar webs of control through debt structures, conditional aid packages, and the strategic placement of compliant leaders. The genius of this system lay in its ability to maintain the appearance of sovereignty while ensuring substantive control. African nations could fly their flags and sing their anthems, but the real decisions about resource allocation, trade partnerships, and development priorities were made in European capitals and American boardrooms. Russian military bases represent something far more threatening to this established order than mere geopolitical competition. They signify the emergence of alternative security partnerships that don't come with the suffocating conditions Western powers have always imposed. When African leaders choose Russian security cooperation, they're not just diversifying their military relationships. They're fundamentally rejecting the premise that their sovereignty requires Western approval. The establishment of Russian bases coincides with a broader economic realignment that strikes at the core of Western wealth extraction. African nations are increasingly negotiating direct resource deals with non-Western powers, bypassing the traditional intermediary systems that have enriched European and American companies for generations. Consider the uranium trade from Niger, where French nuclear giant Areva historically paid prices so low they bordered on theft. While French citizens enjoyed some of the world's cheapest electricity powered by Nigerian uranium. The emergence of alternative buyers offering fair market prices doesn't just threaten Areva's profit margins. It challenges the entire economic model upon which French energy independence has been built. Similarly, gold mining operations across the Sahel have historically been structured to maximize Western corporate profits while minimizing local benefits. Russian partnerships increasingly offer different terms: technology transfer, local value addition, and revenue-sharing agreements that actually benefit African peoples, rather than merely enriching foreign shareholders and their local collaborators. The Western panic intensifies because they recognize these aren't temporary market fluctuations. This represents a fundamental shift toward South-South cooperation that permanently alters global value chains. When African nations can sell their cobalt directly to Chinese battery manufacturers, their lithium to Russian energy companies, and their agricultural products to Middle Eastern markets, the Western position as unavoidable intermediaries evaporates. This economic realignment explains why Western media coverage of Russian bases focuses obsessively on security concerns, while studiously avoiding any discussion of the accompanying economic partnerships. They understand that exposing the stark difference in terms would make their own exploitative relationships impossible to defend. African leaders choosing Russian military cooperation aren't making emotional decisions or falling for foreign manipulation, as Western commentators condescendingly suggest. They're implementing sophisticated security strategies based on realistic assessments of their defense needs and geopolitical constraints. Traditional Western military partnerships came with strings attached that often proved more constraining than helpful. American military aid typically required purchasing American weapons systems, using American training protocols, and accepting American strategic priorities that didn't necessarily align with African interests. French military cooperation in the Sahel exemplified this dynamic. French forces intervened when French interests were threatened, but remained conspicuously absent when African civilian populations faced genocidal violence that didn't threaten French corporate assets. Russian military cooperation offers something qualitatively different: weapon systems designed for the specific challenges African forces face, training programs that build genuine capacity rather than dependency, and partnership agreements that respect African strategic autonomy. Russian military advisors don't arrive with predetermined political agendas about governance structures or economic policies. Their mandate focuses on the professional development of African military capabilities. This distinction terrifies Western strategists because it undermines one of their primary mechanisms of control. For decades, military cooperation served as both a source of influence and a justification for intervention. The threat of withdrawn security assistance could force policy changes, while the presence of Western military advisors provided intelligence and political leverage that extended far beyond purely military matters. Russian bases eliminate this leverage while providing African nations with credible defense capabilities that don't come with political conditions. African leaders can pursue domestic policies that serve their populations without worrying about Western military partners, withdrawing support over disagreements about governance approaches or economic models. Perhaps the most profound source of Western anxiety lies in the ideological realm. Russian presence in Africa doesn't just challenge Western geopolitical dominance. It demolishes the carefully constructed narrative of Western moral superiority that has justified centuries of exploitation. Western foreign policy discourse relies heavily on the assumption that Western nations represent universal values and democratic ideals that the rest of the world should aspire to emulate. This narrative portrays Western intervention as benevolent guidance rather than self-interested exploitation, and Western criticism of African leaders as principled advocacy for human rights rather than attempts to maintain client relationships. Russian military cooperation operates from a fundamentally different ideological framework. Russia doesn't position itself as a moral authority seeking to improve African governance. It offers partnership based on mutual interests and respect for sovereignty, without demanding that African nations conform to particular political models or social arrangements. This approach resonates powerfully with African leaders and populations who have experienced decades of Western lectures about democracy and human rights, while watching the same Western powers support dictators who served Western interests and overthrow elected governments that challenged Western economic privileges. The emergence of alternative partnerships that don't require ideological subordination exposes the hollow rhetoric of Western moral leadership. When African nations can pursue security cooperation without enduring constant criticism of their domestic policies, the entire Western framework of conditional engagement loses its persuasive power. The Western panic over Russian bases reflects a deeper anxiety about demographic trends that make their traditional influence strategies increasingly obsolete. Africa's population is overwhelmingly young, with median ages in many countries below 25 years. This generation has no personal memory of the Cold War dynamics that older Western policymakers continue to reference in their strategic thinking. Young Africans evaluate international partnerships based on concrete benefits rather than historical allegiances or ideological preferences. They're more likely to support leaders who secure favorable terms for infrastructure development, technology transfer, and educational opportunities, regardless of which global powers provide these benefits. This pragmatic approach to international relations terrifies Western strategists who have relied on ideological appeal and historical relationships to maintain influence. Furthermore, young Africans increasingly access information through digital platforms that circumvent Western media gatekeeping. They can directly observe the terms of Chinese infrastructure projects, Russian military cooperation, and Middle Eastern investment initiatives without filtering these observations through Western media narratives that emphasize geopolitical competition over practical benefits. This generational shift toward practical evaluation of international partnerships fundamentally undermines Western soft power advantages. Young Africans don't automatically defer to Western universities, media outlets, or cultural institutions as sources of authoritative analysis. They're creating their own information networks and developing their own analytical frameworks that prioritize African interests over Western perspectives. The implications extend beyond immediate policy preferences. As this generation assumes leadership positions across African institutions, they are likely to institutionalize approaches to international relations that treat Western powers as one set of potential partners among many, rather than as natural hegemons whose preferences deserve special consideration. Russian military bases represent individual bilateral agreements, but their broader significance lies in how they contribute to emerging patterns of continental integration that bypass Western institutional frameworks. African leaders are increasingly coordinating their international partnerships to maximize collective bargaining power and reduce individual vulnerabilities to external pressure. The African Continental Free Trade Area creates the economic foundation for this strategic coordination by reducing African dependence on extra-continental trade relationships. As intra-African trade volumes increase, individual African economies become less vulnerable to Western economic sanctions or conditional aid withdrawal. This economic integration provides the foundation for coordinated approaches to security cooperation that prioritize African strategic interests over external preferences. Russian bases contribute to this continental strategy by providing security guarantees that don't require African nations to subordinate their economic policies to Western preferences. African leaders can pursue closer integration with each other without worrying that Western partners will punish such cooperation by withdrawing security assistance or imposing economic sanctions. This dynamic terrifies Western strategists because it threatens their ability to divide and conquer. For centuries, European powers maintained control by preventing African political coordination, ensuring that individual African nations remained too weak to effectively resist exploitation. The emergence of continental integration supported by alternative security partnerships eliminates this strategic advantage. Western powers find themselves increasingly unable to isolate African nations that challenge their interests because those nations can rely on continental solidarity and alternative partnerships for both economic support and security cooperation. The traditional tools of neocolonial control, economic isolation, security abandonment, and political delegitimization lose their effectiveness when their targets can access alternative sources of support. The intensity of Western media coverage regarding Russian bases reveals the sophistication of their information warfare strategies and their recognition that the battle for African public opinion represents a crucial front in the broader struggle over continental sovereignty. Western media outlets systematically portray Russian military cooperation as inherently threatening while presenting Western military presence as stabilizing, despite overwhelming historical evidence contradicting these characterizations. This media manipulation operates through several mechanisms. First, Western outlets consistently emphasize the military dimensions of Russian partnerships while downplaying or ignoring the economic and technological components that actually drive African interest. Second, they frame African choices to diversify partnerships as evidence of external manipulation rather than expressions of strategic autonomy. Third, they systematically amplify voices that support Western positions while marginalizing African perspectives that challenge Western narratives. The sophistication of this information campaign reflects Western recognition that their traditional mechanisms of control depend on maintaining ideological hegemony. If African populations begin to see Western concerns about Russian bases as expressions of self-interested anxiety rather than genuine worry about African welfare, the entire framework of Western moral authority collapses. African media outlets and independent analysts increasingly challenge these narratives by providing alternative frameworks for understanding international partnerships. They examine the actual terms of Russian cooperation agreements, compare them to historical Western arrangements, and evaluate them based on their practical benefits for African development rather than their implications for global power balances. This emerging information ecosystem terrifies Western strategists because it undermines their ability to shape African public opinion through controlled narratives. When African populations can access independent analysis of international partnerships, they are more likely to support leaders who negotiate favorable terms, regardless of Western preferences. Ibrahim Traoré's leadership in Burkina Faso exemplifies the sophisticated strategic thinking that drives Western panic over Russian bases. Traoré didn't emerge from a military academy or inherit political power. He represents a new generation of African leaders who combine technical expertise with authentic commitment to sovereignty and development. His approach to international partnerships reflects the pragmatic sophistication that characterizes this new generation of African leadership. Traoré evaluates potential partnerships based on their concrete benefits for Burkinabe development and security, rather than their alignment with inherited ideological frameworks or historical relationships. This approach leads naturally to diversified partnerships that include Russian military cooperation alongside economic relationships with multiple global partners. Western criticism of Traoré focuses obsessively on his military background, while ignoring his educational achievements and technical expertise. They portray his rise to power as evidence of instability rather than recognition of his competence by Burkinabe institutions. This framing reveals their inability to comprehend African leadership selection processes that prioritize effectiveness over Western approval. Traoré's youth and technical background make him particularly threatening to Western interests because he represents trends that extend far beyond Burkina Faso. Across Africa, young leaders with technical training are assuming positions of authority and implementing policies that prioritize African interests over external preferences. These leaders typically speak multiple languages, understand global economic systems, and maintain extensive networks across the continent. Their approach to governance emphasizes practical problem-solving over ideological conformity, infrastructure development over symbolic politics, and continental integration over external dependency. This leadership style resonates powerfully with young African populations who judge their leaders based on delivered improvements in living standards rather than international approval ratings. The panic over Russian bases intensifies when examined alongside broader trends toward resource sovereignty that threaten the fundamental architecture of Western wealth extraction. African nations are increasingly asserting direct control over their natural resources and negotiating partnerships that maximize local benefits rather than external profits. This transformation operates across multiple sectors simultaneously. Mining operations are increasingly required to include local value addition, technology transfer, and community development components. Agricultural partnerships emphasize food security and export diversification rather than monocrop production for external markets. Energy projects prioritize domestic consumption and regional integration over export-oriented extraction. Russian partnerships often include provisions that support these sovereignty objectives. Russian mining companies typically offer more favorable terms for local content requirements and technology transfer than their Western counterparts. Russian agricultural cooperation emphasizes food security and sustainable farming techniques rather than export crop specialization. Russian energy partnerships often include power generation and distribution infrastructure that serves domestic populations rather than purely extractive facilities. These partnership terms reflect fundamental differences in approach that extend beyond individual agreements. Russian economic cooperation generally operates through state-controlled entities that can prioritize long-term strategic relationships over short-term profit maximization. This approach enables more favorable terms for African partners who are seeking to build domestic capacity rather than merely export raw materials. Western companies, constrained by shareholder profit expectations and quarterly reporting requirements, typically cannot match these terms without fundamentally altering their business models. Their partnerships historically succeeded by minimizing local benefits and maximizing extraction efficiency, approaches that become unsustainable when African governments can access alternative partnerships offering better terms. Russian military cooperation includes substantial technology transfer components that address one of Africa's most critical development challenges: building indigenous technological capacity. Unlike Western military partnerships that typically create permanent dependency on external suppliers, Russian cooperation often includes provisions for local production and maintenance capabilities. This technology transfer extends beyond purely military applications. Russian partnerships often include civilian technology components that support broader development objectives. Agricultural technology, mining equipment, energy infrastructure, and transportation systems often accompany military cooperation agreements, creating comprehensive development partnerships rather than narrow security arrangements. The implications extend far beyond immediate economic benefits. Technology transfer enables African nations to build the domestic capacity necessary for sustained development and genuine sovereignty. When African engineers can maintain and modify imported equipment, African factories can produce components for infrastructure projects, and African technicians can operate sophisticated systems, the foundation for long-term independence from external dependency emerges. Western partnerships historically avoided meaningful technology transfer because it threatened their long-term market dominance. Maintaining African technological dependency ensured continued demand for Western products and services while preventing the emergence of competitive African alternatives. Russian willingness to include substantial technology transfer in their partnerships represents an existential threat to this business model. The establishment of Russian bases contributes to emerging continental security arrangements that prioritize African strategic interests over external power projection. These arrangements reflect sophisticated understanding of security challenges that require continental rather than purely national responses. Migration pressures, climate change impacts, resource competition, and transnational criminal networks create security challenges that individual African nations cannot address effectively through isolated national responses. Continental security cooperation enables coordinated approaches that address root causes rather than merely responding to symptoms. Russian military cooperation supports this continental approach by providing security capabilities that don't come with restrictions on African cooperation with other global partners. African nations can maintain security partnerships with Russia while simultaneously developing economic relationships with China, diplomatic cooperation with Middle Eastern countries, and technological partnerships with various global actors. This flexibility terrifies Western strategists who have relied on exclusive partnerships to maintain control over African policy options. When African nations can access security cooperation without accepting restrictions on their other international relationships, Western leverage over African decision-making processes evaporates. The emerging continental security architecture also includes provisions for mutual defense and collective response to external threats. These arrangements reduce individual African vulnerabilities to external pressure while creating deterrent effects that make external intervention more costly and less likely to succeed. The Western panic over Russian bases reflects their recognition that current trends toward African sovereignty are likely irreversible. Demographic momentum, economic integration, technological advancement, and political maturation create self-reinforcing dynamics that make return to neocolonial dependency increasingly unlikely. Young African populations increasingly expect their leaders to deliver concrete improvements in living standards, infrastructure development, and educational opportunities. These expectations create powerful incentives for African leaders to negotiate international partnerships that maximize benefits for their populations rather than external partners. Economic integration through the African Continental Free Trade Area creates opportunities for intra-African trade and investment that reduce dependence on external markets. As African economies become more integrated with each other, they become less vulnerable to external economic pressure and more capable of pursuing independent policies. Technological advancement enables African institutions to access information, coordinate policies, and implement development projects without relying on external expertise or approval. Digital communications, satellite technology, and renewable energy systems provide the infrastructure for sustained independence from external control. Political maturation manifests in the emergence of leaders who combine technical competence with authentic commitment to African interests. These leaders typically possess the educational background and professional experience necessary to negotiate complex international agreements while maintaining primary loyalty to their domestic constituencies. What we're witnessing across Africa represents something far more profound than routine geopolitical realignment. This is a continental awakening to the reality of African strength, the legitimacy of African interests, and the inevitability of African sovereignty. Russian bases represent one manifestation of this awakening, but the underlying dynamic extends far beyond any single partnership or relationship. African leaders increasingly recognize that they possess the demographic weight, resource endowments, and strategic positions necessary to negotiate international relationships as equals rather than supplicants. This recognition manifests in more assertive approaches to partnership negotiations, more demanding terms for resource extraction agreements, and more sophisticated strategies for leveraging competitive dynamics among potential partners. The transformation includes cultural and intellectual dimensions that may prove even more significant than economic or military changes. African universities increasingly produce graduates who possess world-class technical skills without internalizing assumptions about Western superiority or African inadequacy. African media outlets increasingly provide analysis that prioritizes African perspectives over external narratives. African artists, writers, and intellectuals increasingly create works that celebrate African achievements and possibilities rather than seeking external validation. This cultural renaissance provides the ideological foundation for political and economic sovereignty. When African populations possess confidence in their own capabilities and pride in their own achievements, they naturally support leaders who pursue policies that serve African interests regardless of external preferences. The Western establishment's panic over Russian military bases in Africa reveals the depth of their recognition that their centuries of dominance are drawing to a close. This isn't merely about losing influence to a competitor. It's about witnessing the emergence of a genuinely multipolar world, where Africa occupies its rightful position as a major power center. The sophisticated strategic thinking that leaders like Ibrahim Traoré represent terrifies Western elites precisely because it demonstrates African capacity for independent analysis and autonomous decision-making. When African leaders can evaluate international partnerships based on concrete benefits rather than inherited ideologies, they naturally choose arrangements that serve African interests over Western preferences. The momentum behind African sovereignty movements has become unstoppable because it draws strength from demographic reality, economic necessity, and political maturation. Young African populations will not accept the subordinate positions that previous generations were forced to endure. African economies will not remain permanently dependent on external partners who offer exploitative terms. African leaders will not defer to external authorities who prioritize foreign interests over African welfare. Russian bases represent one symbol of this transformation, but the underlying dynamic extends far beyond any single partnership. Africa is reclaiming its position as a major center of global civilization, and no amount of Western panic can reverse this historical trajectory. The question for African populations is not whether this transformation will continue, it's whether we'll actively support leaders who accelerate this process or allow those who would slow it to maintain positions of authority. The choice belongs to us, and the time for that choice is now. This channel exists to provide the analysis and perspective necessary for making that choice wisely. If this content helps you understand the significance of current developments and the possibilities they represent for African sovereignty, please show your support by liking this video, subscribing to our channel, and hitting that notification bell so you never miss our latest analysis. Share this video with others who need to understand why Western elites are panicking and what their panic reveals about Africa's rising power. Your engagement directly supports the African sovereignty movement by ensuring these perspectives reach the audiences who need to hear them. The future belongs to Africa, and that future is arriving faster than anyone expected. Let's make sure we're ready for it. Like this video if you believe in African sovereignty. Subscribe for more analysis that puts African interests first. Ring that notification bell because the mainstream media won't tell you these truths. Share this content to spread awareness about Africa's rightful emergence as a global power. Your engagement is your contribution to the sovereignty movement.